She belongs to me now. The room fell silent. Ethan Cade's words cut through the haze of the crowded alien marketplace like a blade. Hundreds of eyes, some human but most not, turned toward him, their gazes reflecting a mix of curiosity, fear, and disbelief. The object of his demand, a Xyrean woman, stood on the auction block, her wrists bound in shimmering alloy cuffs. Her violet skin shimmered faintly under the harsh neon lights, and her eyes, intense amethyst-colored, narrowed at Ethan with a glare that could burn through steel. Ethan felt the weight of her gaze but didn't waver. He had a reputation to uphold, and in this galaxy, reputation was currency. He was no saint, far from it. A former Terran Alliance soldier turned rogue operator, his life was a web of shady deals, battles fought on forgotten worlds, and debts paid in blood. Yet this time, his decision to intervene wasn't about profit. Something about the woman on the block struck him, though he couldn't say why. Maybe it was the way she held her head high despite the jeers and leers of the crowd. Maybe it was the raw defiance in her stance, even in chains. The auctioneer, a bloated creature with slick, translucent skin, shifted uncomfortably. "Mr. Cade, this is highly irregular. The Xyrean was meant for sale, not barter." "I didn't ask for a debate," Ethan replied, his tone cold. He stepped closer, the weight of his armored boots echoing against the metallic floor. "You owe me. You either hand her over, or I take her and everything else you're selling." The crowd muttered, sensing tension. The auctioneer's eyes darted to the security detail, heavily armed thugs who now hesitated, glancing nervously at Ethan. He had a reputation for making quick work of anyone foolish enough to challenge him. "Fine," the auctioneer hissed, slapping a slimy appendage against the control panel. The woman's cuffs unlocked with a faint hiss, and she stepped forward, her movements cautious but controlled. Ethan caught a flash of something in her eyes. Relief? No, it was something sharper, calculating. As she walked toward him, chains clinking softly, he wondered if he had just made a mistake. What would you have done in Ethan's place? Let me know in the comments. And don't forget to like and subscribe if you're hooked already. This story is only just beginning. Ethan turned to leave, the woman following silently at his side. They moved through the marketplace, where the chaos resumed as quickly as it had paused. Merchants shouted, buyers haggled, and the stench of alien spices and ozone filled the air. He glanced at his new payment out of the corner of his eye. She walked with a confidence that didn't match her status as a supposed slave. Her chin was high, her gaze unflinching as it swept over the crowd. "What's your name?" Ethan asked, his voice low enough to avoid attracting attention. "Do I need one?" she shot back, her tone clipped and regal. Ethan smirked. "You're feisty for someone who just got bought." She stopped abruptly, forcing him to turn and face her. The crowd moved around them like water around a rock. "I wasn't bought. You demanded me as if I were a tool or a weapon. I don't belong to you." Her words caught him off guard, though he didn't show it. Instead, he leaned in, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Listen, princess, I just saved you from being sold to the highest bidder. You might want to show a little gratitude." Her lips curled into a faint, mocking smile. Gratitude? To a man who thinks freedom is something he can demand. "Spare me." Ethan stared at her, searching for the right response. But before he could find it, a sudden commotion erupted behind them. Shouts echoed through the market, followed by the unmistakable sound of blaster fire. Ethan grabbed the woman's wrist and pulled her into the shadows of a nearby alley just as a group of armed enforcers stormed past. "Looks like someone didn't like our deal," Ethan muttered. The woman yanked her wrist free, her eyes narrowing. "And now I'm supposed to trust you to get us out of this alive." "You don't have a choice," Ethan shot back. "Stick with me, or take your chances out there." For a moment, she hesitated. Then, with a reluctant nod, she followed as he led her deeper into the maze of alleyways. As they moved, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that he'd underestimated her. She wasn't just another victim of the galaxy's cruelty. She was something more, and he was about to find out exactly what. Ethan led her through the labyrinth of alleys, his instincts sharp as the sound of boots thudded in the distance. The enforcers were sweeping the market, their shouts growing louder. Every turn felt like threading a needle in a storm. His grip on the woman's wrist tightened as he whispered over his shoulder, "Keep up, or you're on your own." "I'm not a child," she snapped, matching his pace with surprising ease despite her bare feet and the uneven terrain. The marketplace was sprawling, a mix of towering metal structures and sprawling tarpaulin stalls, lit by glowing plasma lanterns. The alleys smelled of charred circuitry and stale alien food. Ethan glanced back at her again. Her expression hadn't changed, still cold, still unreadable. But her sharp eyes darted to every corner, scanning their surroundings like a predator. A shadow flickered at the alley's end. Ethan raised a hand, motioning for silence. She froze without a word, crouching low behind him as he pulled his blaster from its holster. The weapon hummed faintly, its barrel glowing faintly blue. He rounded the corner quickly, aiming, only to lower it again. A scrawny alien child bolted at the sight of him, disappearing into the night. "Paranoid much?" she muttered, stepping forward. "Paranoid is how you survive," he shot back. He gestured to the far end of the alley, where a rusted transport ship rested on landing struts. Its hull was battered, streaked with burn marks and dents, but it was still intact. "That's our way out." She studied the ship and crossed her arms. "That's what you're betting my life on. Your life's already a gamble. This just evens the odds." Ethan moved quickly, scanning for movement as he led her up the ramp and into the ship's belly. The interior was dimly lit and cramped, wires spilling out of open panels like entrails. A faint hum of energy told him the engines were in standby mode, just enough juice to start up if he worked fast. "Stay here," Ethan ordered as he moved toward the cockpit. "Why?" "Afraid I'll steal it," she quipped, leaning casually against the support beam. He ignored her and slid into the pilot's seat, fingers flying over the controls. The console flickered to life, and the ship groaned as its systems began powering up. A deep thrum filled the air, vibrating through the metal floor. But before he could engage the engines, a sharp warning blared from the console. He cursed under his breath. "What now?" she asked, stepping into the cockpit. "Tracking beacon," Ethan replied, his jaw tightening. "They tagged us during the escape. Enforcers will be swarming this place in minutes." Her eyes narrowed, and for the first time, he saw something resembling concern on her face. "Can you disable it?" "Not in time," he said. His mind raced, calculating their odds. "But I can rig a decoy. It'll give us a head start, at least." He stood abruptly, brushing past her. She followed as he rummaged through the cargo hold, pulling out a small crate. Inside were various pieces of equipment, spare parts, old tech, and enough explosive material to make a statement. As he worked, she leaned against the bulkhead, watching him intently. "You've done this before," she remarked. "More times than I'd like," Ethan replied without looking up. "But I'm guessing you've seen worse." Her silence stretched just long enough to make him glance up. She wasn't looking at him anymore. Her gaze was distant, as if lost in a memory. He didn't press. Everyone in this galaxy had scars. Some just wore them better than others. He finished the decoy and set it near the beacon's signal relay. "This'll detonate when they close in. Hopefully, they'll think we went up in flames." "Hopefully?" she repeated, raising an eyebrow. Ethan grinned. What's life without a little risk? Before she could respond, the ship shuddered as blaster fire ricocheted off its hull. The enforcers had arrived. "Strap in," Ethan barked, sprinting back to the cockpit. He slammed into the pilot's seat and engaged the engines. The ship roared to life, shaking violently as it lifted off the ground. The woman stumbled but caught herself, gripping the co-pilot's chair as Ethan punched the throttle. The transport shot upward, narrowly avoiding a barrage of blaster fire. The force pinned them to their seats as they broke through the marketplace's domed shield and into the starry void of space. Ethan glanced at the console, watching the proximity sensors light up like a festival display. "They're still on us," she said, her voice calm but edged with tension. "Yeah, I noticed," Ethan muttered. He flipped a series of switches, rerouting power to the engines. The ship groaned under the strain, but it surged forward, pulling ahead of their pursuers. "The decoy better work, or this'll be a short trip." Seconds later, a bright flash lit up the console's rear display. The decoy had detonated. The woman leaned forward, watching as the pursuing ships hesitated, splitting off to investigate the explosion. Ethan exhaled, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. "That's one problem down. For now," she said, her tone grim. Ethan turned to her, his smirk returning. "You're a real ray of sunshine, you know that?" She didn't respond, her gaze fixed on the stars ahead. Something about her quiet intensity unsettled him. He had dealt with plenty of dangerous people in his line of work, but she was different. There was a depth to her, a weight that hinted at something far beyond a simple escape from slavery. "What's your story?" Ethan asked finally. She turned to him, her expression unreadable. "You don't want to know? Try me," he said, leaning back in his chair. For a moment, it seemed like she might actually tell him. But then she stood, her movements fluid and deliberate. "Get us somewhere safe first. Then we'll talk." As she walked out of the cockpit, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that he had just stepped into something far bigger than himself. And for the first time in a long time, he wasn't sure if he'd make it out alive. Ethan charted a course into unregulated space, the kind of no man's land where laws and governments didn't reach. He activated the autopilot once they were safely out of range, leaning back in his chair as the hum of the ship settled into a steady rhythm. The woman hadn't returned to the cockpit, leaving him alone with his thoughts. He wasn't sure if he was relieved or unsettled by that. After a few minutes, he got up and made his way to the galley, a cramped space lined with dented storage compartments and a single flickering light. She was there, sitting cross-legged on the floor, inspecting one of the tools he'd left out earlier. She didn't look up as he entered. "Figured you want to rest," Ethan said, leaning against the doorway. "I don't sleep well on strange ships," she replied, her tone as neutral as ever. "Too many bad experiences." Ethan raised an eyebrow but didn't press. Instead, he rummaged through a storage bin and pulled out 2 self-heating meal packs. He tossed one to her, and she caught it without looking, her reflexes unervingly sharp. He sat across from her, ripping the top off his pack and letting the scent of synthetic stew waft out. "So," he said between bites, "are you going to tell me who you really are, or do I have to guess?" She finally looked up, her amethyst eyes locking onto his. For a moment, he thought she might ignore him again, but then she spoke. "You don't recognize me, do you?" Ethan frowned. "Should I?" A ghost of a smile played on her lips. It wasn't warm, it was almost sad. "That depends on how much you pay attention to galactic politics." "Not much," Ethan admitted, too busy trying to stay alive. She set the tool down and leaned back against the wall. "My name is Lasara. I'm the last surviving heir of the Xyrean royal bloodline." Ethan blinked, momentarily stunned. "A princess? Seriously?" "Technically, I was a queen," she corrected, "for about 6 hours. Then my uncle staged a coup, executed my family, and sold me off to slavers." Ethan let out a low whistle. "That's a hell of a story." "It's not a story. It's my life," she said, her voice cold. "And now I'm stuck here, trading one captor for another." Ethan held up his hands. "Hey, I'm not your captor. I just got you out of a bad situation. And what are you expecting in return?" she asked, her gaze piercing. "Nothing," he said quickly. Too quickly. Her skepticism was palpable, and he couldn't entirely blame her. "Okay, maybe I thought you could be useful. You obviously know how to handle yourself. But I'm not keeping you prisoner." She studied him for a long moment, then nodded, as if satisfied for now. Fair enough. They ate in silence after that, the hum of the ship the only sound. Ethan couldn't shake the unease creeping over him. A runaway royal was the last thing he needed. It explained her sharpness, her defiance, and her refusal to show weakness. But it also meant she came with a galaxy-sized target on her back. "What's your plan?" he asked finally. She shrugged. "I didn't have one. Survival was all I could think about." "Well, you survived," he said. "Now what?" Her eyes darkened. "Now I take back what's mine." Ethan stared at her, unsure if he should laugh or be impressed. "You're serious. Deadly serious," she said. "My people are suffering under my uncle's rule. The Xyrean throne wasn't just a seat of power. It was a responsibility, one I failed to protect." "Sounds noble," Ethan said, leaning back. "But you don't exactly have an army, or a fleet, or anything really." "Yet," she replied, her tone steely. "But I have something my uncle doesn't, a reason to fight." Ethan shook his head, smirking despite himself. "You're crazy. You know that, right?" "Maybe," she said, standing and tossing her empty meal pack into the trash. "But I don't have a choice." She left the galley, leaving Ethan alone with his thoughts. He finished his meal slowly, her words echoing in his mind. He'd been through enough wars to know that noble intentions didn't win battles. Resources, strategy, and firepower did. And yet, there was something about her conviction that he couldn't dismiss. As he cleaned up, a warning light blinked on the nearby console. He frowned and tapped the screen, bringing up the ship's sensor feed. A single blip appeared, moving toward them at high speed. "Damn it," he muttered, hurrying to the cockpit. Lasara was already there, standing behind the pilot's seat and staring at the same sensor readout. "They found us," she said, her voice calm but tight. "Looks like it," Ethan replied, sliding into the seat and scanning the data. The ship wasn't a standard enforcer patrol. It was a Xyrean cruiser. "That's not just anyone," Lasara said, her tone grim. "That's my uncle's personal fleet." Ethan's stomach sank. "Of course it is. They won't stop," she said. "Not until I'm dead." Ethan's mind raced. He couldn't outrun a cruiser, not in this rust bucket. And fighting was out of the question. His options were limited, and none of them were good. "I hope you've got a plan, Princess," he said, flipping switches and redirecting power to the ship's shields. "Do you trust me?" she asked suddenly. He snorted. "Not even a little." "Good," she said, a faint smile touching her lips. "Then this should be fun." Ethan's fingers tightened on the controls, his heart racing as he scanned the incoming threat. The Xyrean cruiser was too fast, too well-armed for them to outrun. There wasn't a way through, but there was a way around. "We can't outrun them," he muttered, analyzing the data. The cruiser was locking onto them, its weapon systems priming. "But we can try to confuse them." Lasara didn't respond immediately. Instead, she studied the situation, her eyes flicking between the readouts. She seemed calm, too calm. Then, she did something Ethan hadn't expected. She placed a hand on the control panel and hit a series of buttons that activated the ship's old cloaking system. "What the hell?" Ethan started to protest, but the ship shuddered, its engine sputtering as the cloaking system hummed to life, distorting the air around them. "We don't have time for subtlety," she said, her tone sharper now. "Activate the warp drive. Full power now." Ethan hesitated, glancing at her. "That's a risk. If we get it wrong..." "Do it," she snapped. He punched in the coordinates for the nearest asteroid field, a maze of debris that could offer them cover. The ship's warp drive fired up, and the entire hull groaned under the sudden acceleration. The cruiser fired, but they were already a split second ahead of the blast, zipping through the edges of the asteroid field at breakneck speed. Ethan's hands gripped the controls like they were the only thing keeping him tethered to reality. The asteroid field was dense, the rocks careening past them in jagged bursts of silver and gray. The ship rocked with each near miss, the hull groaning under the pressure. Lasara remained silent, her face a mask of concentration. Ethan could feel her presence, her calmness acting as a strange anchor amidst the chaos. There was a strange synchronicity between them as they worked in tandem, him navigating through the debris, her tracking the ship systems and making quick, tactical decisions. But despite their best efforts, the Xyrean cruiser was relentless. Its sensors were still locked on their position, and despite their efforts to remain cloaked and out of sight, the cruiser's tracking system kept them within range. Ethan swore under his breath as the ship's shields flared to life, absorbing another barrage of incoming fire. "This isn't working," Ethan said, his voice rising in frustration. "They'll catch us eventually." "I know," Lasara replied, her voice icy and focused. "But we're not running from them. We're running towards something." Ethan glanced at her, confusion creeping into his thoughts. What the hell does that mean? Before she could respond, the sensors began to spike. A new signal appeared on the radar, an incoming fleet of ships. These weren't Xyrean cruisers. They were something else entirely. Lasara's expression shifted, her eyes narrowing as she watched the fleet's approach. "My people," she said, her voice softened now but filled with resolve. "They're here." Ethan blinked. "Your people? Are they here to help us?" "No," Lasara said, shaking her head. "They're here to test us." The Xyrean cruiser was closing in, its weapons primed, but it didn't fire. Instead, it slowed, hanging back like a predator waiting for its prey to make the first move. "We're in their crosshairs," Ethan said, grimacing. "If they don't help, we're dead." "They'll help," Lasara said, her voice carrying a certainty that made Ethan feel uneasy. "But not in the way you think." Ethan didn't have time to process her words before the new fleet of ships reached them. They were sleek and dark, their hulls shimmering under the dim light of the nearby stars. These ships weren't just military. There was a deadly elegance to them. It was clear that whoever controlled them had more power than the Xyreans. The Xyrean cruiser's weapons powered down, its hull glowing a faint blue as if in deference to the new arrivals. The moment of hesitation was enough. Lasara's ship darted toward the new fleet, weaving between the asteroids with expert precision. The cruiser didn't follow, at least, not immediately. They had a few precious moments. The lead ship of the new fleet hailed them, its voice crackling through the comms. "This is Captain Kalen of the Valtora. Identify yourself." Lasara stepped forward, her back straight and her eyes fixed on the screen. "I am Lasara Xyrean, rightful heir to the Xyrean throne. I demand your assistance." The voice on the other end paused for a beat before responding. "Lasara Xyrean, the last princess." There was a long silence, then a chuckle. "You've certainly caused a stir. What do you want, princess?" "I need refuge and the means to take back my throne," Lasara replied, her voice unwavering. "I'm not asking for charity. I'm asking for an alliance." The response was slow, contemplative. "An alliance? With you?" After everything, Ethan watched as Lasara's eyes flicked to the side, her jaw clenching slightly. "You'll find that I'm not the same helpless princess who ran from her fate. I've learned from my mistakes." The voice on the other end seemed to soften. "Perhaps, but a woman with a broken crown is a dangerous thing, Lasara. We'll discuss this further when you land." The screen went dark and the comms went silent. Lasara turned to Ethan, her expression unreadable. "It's done," she said, her voice quieter now. "They're going to help us, but they expect something in return." "Of course they do," Ethan muttered, his grip on the controls tightening again. "Be ready," she said. "We're not out of the woods yet, but this is the first step." As the sleek fleet led them toward an unknown destination, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a storm, one that would either forge their destiny or destroy them entirely. The stakes had just gone up, and for the first time, Ethan wasn't sure if he was still in control. Ethan's hands gripped the controls as they approached the lead ship, the Valtora, which loomed larger by the second. Despite their escape from the Xyrean cruiser, The tension between him and Lysara had only escalated. She sat in silence behind him, her eyes narrowed in thought, the weight of her plans pressing down on them both. The Valtora's landing bay was enormous, its dark metallic walls reflecting the light from the distant stars. As Ethan piloted their ship inside, the atmosphere on board shifted from tense to something more like anticipation. Lysara didn't speak. She just stared ahead, as if preparing herself for something that would either make or break everything. The moment the ship's landing gear touched the floor, Ethan powered down the engines, and the loud hum of the ship's systems began to fade into a mechanical silence. A few seconds later, a small group of soldiers emerged from the shadows. Their uniforms were sleek and dark, adorned with insignia that Ethan didn't recognize. Their leader, a tall man with a scar running down the side of his face, stepped forward. "You are Lysara Xyrean?" the man asked, his voice gruff but not unkind. "I am," Lysara replied, her voice steady but colder than before. She stepped out of the ship, her posture regal despite the circumstances. The scarred man nodded and, without a word, gestured for her to follow. Ethan hesitated, but Lysara didn't seem to notice or care. She walked past the man with a calm that made him uneasy. What was it about her that made everyone so deferential? They walked through a long, dimly lit hallway, the walls covered in strange symbols and holograms. The air smelled faintly of metal and something almost ancient. The further they went, the less Ethan felt like he was on a normal ship, and more like he had stepped into a foreign, alien world. When they arrived at a large chamber, Ethan realized why. The room was filled with beings of different shapes and sizes, some humanoid, some not, and they all stared at Lysara as she entered. Some had features that reminded Ethan of the ancient mythologies of his own people. Elongated limbs, glowing eyes, and skin that shimmered like starlight. But there was something different about the way they looked at her. They didn't seem curious. They seemed reverent. Lysara stood tall, undeterred by the scrutiny of the room. Ethan's eyes darted around, trying to read the situation, but the tension in the air was palpable. This was no ordinary gathering. One of the beings, a woman with pale skin and dark, swirling tattoos that ran down her arms, stepped forward. She bowed her head in respect, her eyes locking with Lysara's. "Your Majesty," the woman said, her voice lilting, almost melodic. "It's been a long time." Ethan's mind raced. "Your Majesty?" Lysara hadn't said a word about being crowned queen, or any sort of official role in the rebellion. Was this what she had been leading them to? Lysara's gaze softened for a brief moment, before her face hardened again. "It's good to see you, Maris. But the time for pleasantries is over." Maris nodded, stepping back. "We've been waiting for you. The Xyreans have done more than just destroy your family. They've fractured the galaxy and we felt it. The balance has been disrupted. Your return is not just a matter of reclaiming a throne. It's about restoring what was lost." Ethan's head spun. What was she talking about? This wasn't just a political issue for her. This was something bigger. "Balance?" he asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. "What are you talking about?" Lysara turned to face him for the first time since they had landed, her eyes searching his face. "You think this is about one empire, one throne, one crown?" she asked, her voice low and filled with the weight of unspoken truths. "You think this is about revenge?" Ethan opened his mouth to argue, but she cut him off. "It's not. It never was. The Xyreans are the symptom, not the disease." Before he could ask her what she meant, the woman with the tattoo spoke again. "Your Majesty, we must move quickly. The Xyreans know you're alive. They're already planning their next move." Lysara nodded, her expression hardening. "Let them come. I will not hide any longer." Ethan felt the gravity of her words. She wasn't just fighting for power. She was fighting for something that could change the fate of the entire galaxy. He swallowed, trying to piece together the puzzle. "What exactly are you asking for, Lysara?" "I need your help," she said simply. "And I need their help." She gestured to the group assembled before them. The scarred leader from earlier spoke up again, his voice gruff. "We can offer you the resources, the ships, the allies you need. But know this, what we do next will be dangerous. The Xyreans won't give up their control easily." Ethan glanced at Lysara, whose face was set in determination. "I didn't sign up for a war," he muttered under his breath. She heard him anyway. "You're already in it, Ethan," she said, her voice soft but unwavering. "Whether you want to be or not." Ethan's heart raced again. He hadn't signed up for any of this. But here he was, caught in the middle of a galactic conflict that was about to get a whole lot worse. As he looked around the room, the realization hit him hard. This wasn't just about surviving. This was about fighting for something much larger than himself. The stakes were no longer just personal. The whole galaxy was at risk. Ethan stood there, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He wasn't sure what he had expected when he'd agreed to follow Lysara into this. Chaos, maybe, or betrayal. But now, with the entire room of powerful figures looking at him, the reality of the situation began to sink in. This wasn't just a rebellion against the Xyreans. This was a battle for the future of everything. Lysara's eyes locked onto his again, and for the first time, he saw a flicker of vulnerability in them. It was a momentary lapse, quickly masked by her usual resolve, but it spoke volumes. She wasn't just fighting for a throne. She was fighting for everything she had lost. Her family, her kingdom, and now, perhaps, even her humanity. "I didn't want this for you, Ethan," she said softly, though the room was silent enough that her voice carried. "But we don't have a choice anymore." Ethan clenched his jaw, the resolve growing inside him. "I never had a choice, did I?" He let out a bitter laugh, glancing over at the others who remained silent. "This whole damn thing was just waiting for me to get swept up in it." Lysara's gaze hardened. "You have a choice now," she said, her voice steady once again. "Stay or leave. But if you leave, there's no turning back." The tension in the room shifted as the gathered leaders began to murmur among themselves. Ethan could feel the pressure mounting, his pulse pounding in his ears. They were all waiting for him to decide. What could he say to that? Could he walk away now? Could he really leave Lysara, this planet, this galaxy to burn while he ran for cover? His mind raced, but the truth was inescapable. The Xyreans wouldn't stop with Lysara. They'd come for him, too, eventually. "I'm not leaving," he said finally, his voice low but sure. "But I'm not blindly following you either. I need to know everything. All of it. Why is this so important? What's the Xyrean Empire hiding?" Lysara looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable, before she stepped closer, lowering her voice. "The Xyreans aren't just an empire. They're a dynasty, a race of conquerors. But they were never meant to rule this galaxy. They're corrupted. Do you know why they're so powerful? It's not just their technology or their military might." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Then what is it?" "They've been drawing power from an ancient source, a relic from before recorded history," Lysara explained, her voice taking on a darker, more urgent tone. "The Xyreans discovered it centuries ago, a crystalline artifact buried deep within the core of a forgotten world. They've been siphoning its energy, using it to fuel their conquests and their technology." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. "A relic? You mean they've been using some kind of magic?" Lysara shook her head, but there was a fire in her eyes. "Not magic. Power. Energy. The source is beyond what you can comprehend. It predates even the first empires. It's a force that connects all things in this galaxy." Ethan stared at her, struggling to digest what she was saying. "And you want to stop them from using it?" "No," Lysara replied, her voice tight. "I want to take it back." The weight of her words hit him like a ton of bricks. She wasn't just fighting for a throne or revenge. She was fighting for control of something that could reshape the entire galaxy, something far more dangerous than he'd ever imagined. The power the Xyreans had been toying with wasn't just a tool for conquest. It was a force of nature, something ancient and almost godlike. We'll need more than just ships and soldiers to fight this battle, Ethan said, his mind racing. We'll need an army that can match the Xyreans. We'll need allies from all over the galaxy. Lysara nodded, her gaze unwavering. We will. But first, we need to find the relic. It's the key to everything. If we don't get to it before the Xyreans do, everything is lost. But how? Ethan asked, his skepticism creeping in. How do we even begin to find it? It could be anywhere. We have a lead, Lysara said, turning toward the others in the room. The Valtora has a network of informants. We've been tracking the Xyreans' movements for months. We know where they've been. We just need to narrow it down. The scarred man from earlier, who had been standing in the shadows, stepped forward. His voice was low but firm. We know where the Xyreans are looking, and we have the coordinates to their next target. But it won't be easy. They've got the entire sector under lockdown. Lysara nodded, her eyes flashing with determination. Then we break the lockdown. Ethan looked at the map, the holographic display showing the dense cluster of Xyrean-controlled sectors. A simple mission had already escalated into something far more dangerous. The Xyreans were no longer just an enemy force. They were guardians of an ancient power that could change everything. How do we get in? Ethan asked. Maris, the woman with the tattoos, stepped forward again. We'll need to infiltrate their security systems and disable their defenses long enough to get close to the relic. It's on a remote planet, hidden in the core of a collapsed star system. But the Xyreans will be expecting us. It's a risk, but we have no choice. Lysara turned toward Ethan, her gaze steady. Are you in or are you out? Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. His mind screamed for him to walk away, to leave the madness behind. But the truth was that he couldn't. He wasn't the kind of person who could run when the world needed saving. I'm in, he said, his voice steady. But if this goes south, we're all dead. Lysara gave him a small nod, her lips curling into the faintest of smiles. Then let's make sure it doesn't go south. And just like that, Ethan was no longer a bystander in this war. He was a player, and the stakes had never been higher. The mission had been set in motion. They were to infiltrate a heavily guarded planet on the outer rim, a world once rich with resources, but now reduced to a desolate wasteland under the Xyrean regime. If they succeeded in locating the ancient relic hidden within its depths, it could shift the balance of power in the galaxy. But the road ahead was perilous, and Ethan knew this wasn't just about dodging laser fire and evading security drones. This was a race against time, and every step they took brought them closer to something far darker than they had anticipated. Ethan was in the cockpit once more, his eyes locked on the control panel as he navigated their ship through the dense asteroid field that surrounded the planet. He'd seen countless battles, but there was something about this mission that gnawed at him, something he couldn't shake. Beside him, Lysara sat, silent as ever, her eyes tracing the data on the holographic screens. The quiet between them had become a heavy presence. She was always calm, always composed, but now there was an edge to her, an urgency he hadn't seen before. You're thinking about it too much, she said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan didn't respond immediately. He wasn't sure what to say. Was she referring to the mission, the relic, or the mounting tension between them? Whatever it was, he felt it too, the weight of every decision, every risk they were about to take. I'm just trying to figure out what we're walking into, he finally said, his voice tight. The Xyreans won't just roll over. They've been guarding this place for centuries. Why now? Why let us get this far? Lysara's expression didn't change, but her eyes softened slightly. Because they underestimated us, she said. And because they believe we're nothing more than a nuisance. Ethan glanced at her. She wasn't lying, but she wasn't telling the whole truth either. There was a level of danger here that she wasn't acknowledging, and he could feel it in his gut. Well, they won't be underestimating us for long, he muttered, focusing back on the controls. They made their final approach to the planet, a barren rock orbiting a dying star. The surface was scarred, marked by centuries of mining and exploitation. What had once been a lush planet was now nothing more than a hollowed-out shell of its former self. But beneath its surface, something far more dangerous awaited. As they descended toward the landing zone, the planetary atmosphere grew thicker, the air heavy with the scent of sulfur and dust. There was no sign of life anywhere, no cities, no thriving civilization, just abandoned settlements, the remnants of once proud colonies. "This is where it ends," Lasara said, her voice low. "We land here and the countdown begins. If we're lucky, we'll find the relic before the Xyreans can move in." Ethan didn't respond. He didn't have to. The tension was thick enough to cut through with a knife. The ship touched down, its engines humming quietly as the landing gear locked into place. As the hatch opened, the sound of the harsh winds outside filled the cabin. Lasara was the first to step out, her boots crunching against the dry, cracked earth. Ethan followed closely behind, scanning the barren horizon. There was no sign of movement, no indication that anyone was watching them. Yet he knew better than to trust appearances. "Keep your head on a swivel," he muttered to Lasara. She nodded, her hand resting lightly on the hilt of her weapon. "I'm always alert." They moved swiftly through the wasteland, the ground beneath their feet shifting as they traversed the uneven terrain. The landscape was hostile, with jagged rocks and deep ravines marking the path ahead. They followed the coordinates given to them by Maris, the leader of the underground faction who had been working with Lasara. If the information was correct, the relic was hidden in the deepest part of the planet's core, a long-abandoned research facility that the Xyreans had turned into a fortress. As they neared the entrance to the facility, the atmosphere changed. The air felt heavier, charged with something unseen. A faint, almost imperceptible hum seemed to vibrate through the ground beneath them. "Do you feel that?" Ethan asked, stopping in his tracks. Lasara glanced around, her eyes narrowing. "It's the energy from the relic," she said, her voice tinged with awe. "We're close." They moved cautiously, their every step deliberate. The entrance to the facility was concealed behind a wall of rock, hidden beneath layers of debris and shattered stone. But it didn't take long for Lasara to locate the access point, an old, rusted door barely hanging on its hinges. "After you," she said, stepping aside to let Ethan lead the way. With a nod, Ethan moved forward, using his knife to pry the door open. It creaked in protest as it swung wide, revealing the dark interior. The air inside was stale, musty, and smelled faintly of decay. Their boots echoed off the metal floors as they ventured deeper into the heart of the facility. "Keep your eyes peeled," Ethan said, his voice barely a whisper. "This place is a tomb." Lasara didn't respond. She was already scanning the walls, her attention focused. There was something about the facility that made her uneasy. It wasn't just the silence or the crumbling architecture. There was a deeper sense of foreboding that tugged at her senses. As they moved further in, the darkness grew more oppressive. They came to a large chamber, the walls lined with ancient machinery. But in the center of the room was something far more interesting. A pedestal, surrounded by a circle of symbols and glowing faintly with an unnatural light. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. "That's it, isn't it?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Lasara's eyes locked onto the relic, and for a moment, she seemed lost in its glow. "Yes," she said, her voice quiet but filled with reverence. "That's it. The power the Xyreans have been using. And now, it's ours." But before they could approach, the ground beneath them trembled. A low rumble vibrated through the room, and the lights flickered erratically. Ethan's hand instinctively went to his weapon as he looked around, searching for the source of the disturbance. "They know we're here," Lasara said, her voice steady. "The Xyreans have found us." Ethan's heart raced. They were not alone anymore, and whatever they did next, it had to be quick. "Move!" Ethan shouted, pulling Lasara toward the relic. But before they could reach it, the doors to the chamber slammed shut, with a deafening roar. And from the shadows, a voice echoed in the darkness. "You're too late." The voice that echoed through the chamber was deep and ominous, the kind that carried with it the weight of authority, of power long established. Ethan froze, his hand still gripping the hilt of his weapon, ready for whatever came next. Lysara, too, tense beside him, her eyes scanning the shadows, trying to locate the source of the voice. "Who's there?" Ethan called out, his voice steady despite the pounding in his chest. He knew they had been discovered, but there was no turning back now. The voice chuckled, low and mocking. "You're bold to come here, human, and foolish to think you could take it." From the darkness emerged a figure, tall, clad in Xyrean armor, its dark surface gleaming with an unsettling sheen. The figure stepped into the dim light, revealing a face that was only partially visible beneath a helmet adorned with symbols of the Empire. Lysara's eyes narrowed. "Commander Korik," she hissed under her breath. Ethan recognized the name immediately. Korik was a notorious Xyrean commander known for his ruthlessness. He had led countless campaigns in the Outer Rim, crushing resistance forces with brutal efficiency. And now, it seemed, he was standing between them and their goal. "You know me," Korik said, his voice dripping with disdain. "How quaint, but it doesn't matter. The relic is already mine." Ethan stepped forward, trying to assess the situation. There was no way they could fight him here, not without risking everything. The chamber was too small, too confined. They needed to get to the relic, and they needed to do it quickly. "Why are you here?" Lysara demanded, her voice steady but filled with anger. "You know what this relic means. You can't control it." Korik's lips curled into a grin, though it was hidden beneath the mask. "Control it? No. But I can wield its power. And once the Xyreans know I have it, they will give me whatever I want." The way he said it sent a chill down Ethan's spine. Korik wasn't just after the relic to use it against the galaxy. He was after it to solidify his own rule. And with the kind of power the relic could provide, it was no wonder the Xyreans had sent their best to guard it. "You don't know what you're dealing with," Lysara said, her voice colder now. "You're playing with forces far beyond your comprehension." Korik scoffed. "I've seen what it can do, and I've learned to harness it. You, however, are nothing but a desperate princess trying to reclaim what you lost." The word stung, but Lysara didn't flinch. She knew Korik was trying to provoke her, to weaken her resolve, but she wouldn't let him. "We'll see who's desperate," she said, drawing her weapon. "But you won't be leaving with the relic." Korik laughed, a low, dangerous sound. "We'll see about that." Before Ethan could react, Korik's hand shot out, and a pulse of energy surged from his palm, crashing into the floor. The room trembled again, a tremor that made the walls groan and the ground beneath them crack. Ethan barely had time to react as a wall of energy surged toward them, pushing him and Lysara backward. The blast sent them both stumbling, and they hit the ground hard. Pain exploded through Ethan's chest, but he gritted his teeth, forcing himself to rise. The air in the chamber was charged with an eerie static, and Korik was already advancing, his movements smooth and calculated. He was not just a soldier. He was a weapon in his own right. "Stay down," Lysara muttered, her voice sharp as she pulled Ethan to his feet. She wasn't looking at him, though. Her eyes were fixed on Korik, every muscle in her body coiled, ready to strike. Ethan didn't argue. He could barely breathe through the pressure in his chest, but he knew one thing. They couldn't afford to let Korik win, not when they were so close to the relic. "How do we stop him?" Ethan whispered, struggling to push himself up. His weapon felt heavy in his hand, useless in comparison to the Xyrean commander's abilities. Lysara didn't hesitate. She turned, her eyes blazing with purpose. "We don't stop him. We use him." Ethan blinked, confusion crossing his face. "What?" Lysara's lips curled into a grim smile. "You'll see." Without another word, she launched herself at Korik, her blade flashing through the air. The move was reckless daring, But Ethan realized what she was doing. She wasn't just attacking him. She was distracting him. Korik's response was swift. He raised his hand, preparing to strike her down with another blast of energy. But as his focus shifted, Ethan seized his chance. He dove forward, using the momentum of the distraction, and sprinted toward the pedestal. The relic was within reach. The power it radiated pulled him in, almost magnetically, and he could feel the heat rising from its core. His fingers grazed the smooth surface, and for a moment, nothing happened. The room was deathly silent. Then the lights flickered once more, and the relic flared to life. Energy surged from the pedestal, a pulse that rocked the entire facility. The walls trembled as the power from the relic poured out, filling the chamber with an intense, blinding light. Ethan couldn't see, couldn't breathe, but he could feel it. The raw force of the relic, as if it were alive, reaching into his very soul. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the light dimmed and everything went still. Ethan staggered back, gasping for breath. His hands were shaking, and the world seemed to spin around him. The relic pulsed one last time before it stilled, and he realized that, somehow, he was holding it. Korik stood frozen, his eyes wide in disbelief. The energy around him had dissipated, and the power he had once commanded was now slipping from his grasp. "No," he muttered, taking a step back. Lasara, still breathing hard, turned to Ethan. "You've done it. You've activated it." Ethan didn't have time to process the words. The power in the relic was overwhelming, and he could feel it thrumming in his hands. He knew, without a doubt, that this was no ordinary object. It was the key to everything, and perhaps the most dangerous weapon in the galaxy. "Now we leave," Lasara said, her voice urgent, before he realizes what's happened. But Ethan didn't move. He was staring at Korik, whose expression had shifted from shock to rage. "You think you've won," Korik snarled, stepping forward. "You haven't even begun to understand what you've just unleashed." The final choice had been made. They couldn't run now, not when everything had changed, and the galaxy would never be the same again. The room was silent, save for the hum of the relic in Ethan's hands. His grip tightened, the energy from the artifact still surging through him, wrapping around him like a storm he couldn't control. But he could feel its potential, feel the sheer power that could change everything. Korik's rage only fueled the tension in the room. His eyes blazed with fury as he advanced, his hands crackling with dark energy. The Xyrean commander was no longer the cold, calculating figure he had once been. In his eyes, Ethan saw a desperation that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. "You think you can control it?" Korik spat, his voice venomous. "It will consume you. It will consume everything." Lasara moved into position beside Ethan, her eyes locked on the commander. "It won't control us. Not if we learn to wield it first." Ethan swallowed, his mind racing. The relic had granted him power. Yes, but it had also revealed something else, something far deeper. A vision had flickered in his mind the moment the light had exploded from the pedestal, and in that brief instant he had seen fragments of the galaxy's past, the destruction it had wrought, and the Empire's grip tightening around every planet it touched. And then there was Lasara. His thoughts flashed to her, to the secret she had been hiding, the truth of her identity as a princess in exile. The Xyreans had already known, it seemed, but they underestimated the depths of her power as well. "You're not in control here, Korik," Ethan said, his voice steadier now. "We are." Korik's face twisted into a sneer. "Fool! The moment you activate it, you become its prisoner. You think you can use this to destroy the Xyreans? It will destroy you first." Ethan clenched his jaw, the relic pulsing in his hand. He could feel its weight, its call, urging him to embrace its power. But he knew the danger of wielding it recklessly. The force inside the relic was vast and wild, like a living creature with a mind of its own. The more he resisted it, the more it pushed back. But he couldn't afford to lose control, not when so much was at stake. He glanced at Lysara, and for the first time, he saw a flicker of doubt in her eyes. Her determination was still there, but there was a silent question, an unspoken fear, about what would happen next. "Do you trust me?" he asked, his voice low. Lysara didn't hesitate. "Always." And that was all the confirmation Ethan needed. With a deep breath, he steeled himself, focusing on the relic, on the power that now coursed through him. He felt the pulse of the galaxy itself, as if it were reaching out to him, urging him to take control, to use the energy to strike down Korik and the Xyrean Empire. Korik didn't wait for them to make the first move. With a roar of fury, he unleashed another surge of energy, sending it hurtling toward Ethan and Lysara. The blast was powerful, blinding, but Ethan was ready. He stepped forward, raising his hand and summoning the relic's energy to meet Korik's. The two forces collided with a deafening crack, the impact shaking the very foundation of the facility. Ethan's body was racked with pain, but he held firm, his mind focused on the relic's power, guiding it, shaping it into a shield of raw energy that absorbed Korik's attack. Lysara was at his side in an instant, her blade flashing in the low light as she launched herself at the commander. But Korik, though caught off guard, was not so easily defeated. With a growl, he summoned another wave of energy, this one stronger than before, and it slammed into Ethan, sending him crashing into the ground. For a moment, everything went black. Ethan's vision cleared as he slowly pushed himself up, blood dripping from his temple. The relic was still in his hand, its energy now steady, calm. He could feel it, like a heartbeat resonating with his own. Lysara was locked in combat with Korik, their blades flashing as they traded blows. But Ethan didn't focus on them. He focused on the relic, the power it offered, the balance it required. It wasn't just a weapon, it was a choice. He could feel the weight of that choice settling into his bones. The future of the galaxy, the fate of the Xyrean Empire, and the chance for freedom all hung on the decisions he made in this moment. He turned his focus inward, his mind aligning with the relic's energy. It was like falling into a deep, endless well, and yet there was a clarity, a purpose that guided him. The relic wasn't just about destruction. It was about transformation. It could destroy, yes, but it could also rebuild, heal, and create. With a surge of strength, Ethan pushed the energy out from the relic, directing it at Korik. The blast of power was unlike anything he had ever felt. It roared to life, lighting up the chamber with a brilliance that rivaled a star. Korik was thrown back, his armor crackling with the force of the impact. He hit the ground with a sickening thud, his body twitching as the power of the relic drained the energy from him. Lysara rushed to Ethan's side, her eyes wide with shock. "You did it. You stopped him." Ethan looked down at the relic, his hands still trembling from the intensity of the energy. "No, we did it." Korik groaned from the floor, but there was no more fight left in him. He was defeated. Ethan and Lysara stood there for a long moment, the silence deafening after the chaos. The power of the relic hummed softly in their hands, as if it were waiting for the next command. "We've won," Lysara said softly, her voice filled with a mixture of relief and sorrow. Ethan turned to her, his eyes meeting hers. The weight of their victory was heavy, and yet there was something unspoken between them, an understanding that their journey had only just begun. The galaxy had been forever changed. The Xyreans had been stopped, but there were other battles to fight, other enemies to face. The relic was theirs now, but at what cost? "We've only just begun," Ethan said, his voice determined. And with that, they turned and walked toward the exit, the weight of the relic and the future pressing on their shoulders. But they were ready. Together, they would face whatever came next.